You're listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Hey y'all, Michael here. I am really excited to share this episode, but before I do, I want to suggest you listen to a couple of specific other episodes as well, in case you haven't already. First, this episode is talking about some real history that closely parallels a legend that we discussed in episode 9, the Cora tree. So check that one out. Second, I'd also recommend you listen to episode 50 called Sea Monsters, Pea Island, and Wedby Revisited, as there we talk a little more about things Charlie learned regarding Charles Wedby, the folklorist who first published the story of the Cora tree. One more thing before we get started, check out AC Monthly, our new newsletter. There's a link to subscribe on www.arcanecarolinas.com, and I posted about it also on the Facebook page if you're following us there. It's free. It's just a fun monthly newsletter that we want to do to share a little additional background or research material or maybe preview upcoming episodes, stuff like that. For instance, I'm going to drop a couple of links in that in May regarding additional information that I found interesting when researching for this episode, but I couldn't really fit into the episode itself, like the ranks of nobility that were unique to the Carolinas during the English colonial era. Also, there were some minor audio issues in the course of recording this. Sometimes I buzz a little bit, and I mention it only because normally we try really hard to have a very consistent and high-quality sound, so it bothers me, but I think it'll be fine. So, with those things taken care of, on with the show. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to another fine edition of Arcane Carolinas. I'm your co-host, currently drinking a delicious, ice-cold, refreshing Fresca, Charlie Mushaw.
I am your other co-host, a multi-award-winning novelist, Michael G. Williams, and I remember when Fresca came back. Because I was a teenager at the time. I worked on a state research farm that summer, and I drank Fresca every day.
I remember the first time I brought Fresca in when we worked together, and you were like, Fresca, huh? And I'm like, yeah, good enough for LBJ. It's good enough for me.
I love Fresca. Fresca's great.
Do you know the story about his Fresca button?
Really?
Yeah, LBJ had a button installed in the White House for people to bring him a Fresca.
Wow, that's very focused.
Yeah, it was his Fresca button.
All right. I aspire to a life in which I can have a Fresca button.
I mean, you can make one. It just doesn't mean that people are going to bring it to you, right? Like,
right. Definitely. So for today's episode, we're going to talk about a topic that somebody walked up to the Arcane Carolinas table at the Carolina Theater of Durham and just mentioned in passing as something that they thought we might be interested in researching. I think that it was at Splatterflix film series last year, but I'm not totally sure because we've done tables at Carolina several times now. So if I have misremembered how we came into possession of this tip for a story, then my apologies, but thank you to that person. We're going to be talking about Susannah Evans, Accused Witch.
Okay. It sounds like a on-demand movie. Like it wouldn't, you know what I mean?
It would make a pretty good one.
Yeah, like it doesn't even make it really to Netflix. It's just like on basic cable on demand.
There's so much good stuff in it. So this story takes place in Currituck County, North Carolina, which if you look at a map of North Carolina, that is like way up in northeast North Carolina. It is basically an Albemarle Sound, and it's inside the Outer Banks, like it's on the sound side of the Atlantic Ocean, but it is basically a coastal county, you know.
Wait, so we have a witch story from the coast of an... Oh.
Yeah.
Could it be? Okay, I'll shut up. Oh, connective tissue abounds.
Currituck County is one of the few counties in North Carolina that has no incorporated towns. And in fact, this story takes place in the community, which is an unincorporated community of Currituck, North Carolina, which is effectively the county seat of Currituck County because it's where the English colonial government built the courthouse in the 17th century. At the time, they called that place Currituck Courthouse, but eventually courthouse got dropped from the name, and now it's just referred to as the community of Currituck. Currituck is so small, it is not even a census-designated place.
Okay.
In the colonial era, What is now Currituck County was referred to as the Currituck District or the Currituck Precinct of Albemarle County, which contained like lots of places that we now know by other names. At the time, the nearest indigenous people were the Wiyapimiak or the Yawpim Indians.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Okay. The name Yawpim is believed to be the result of colonists mispronouncing the name Wiyapimiak.
Yeah, I could see that.
And so they like shortened it. But if you go look at like NCpedia, for instance, which is a really great website put together by the State Government and Heritage Library, and it's basically an online encyclopedia of North Carolina facts and history. It is an unbelievably cool website. They have articles in which they refer to them as the Yawpim Indians. There's some debate about what exactly the name Wiyapimiak means and why they chose that for themselves, but generally it is considered either to mean something like where one can find shelter from the wind, or people of the first light. And it's interesting that that's one of the potential interpretations of it, because a lot of similar names for other groups of people in the Algonquin language family basically boil down to the same meaning. The Wiyapimiak were accomplished farmers. They had a maritime culture, they had long-standing alliances and peaceful diplomatic and economic relations with the other peoples around them prior to the colonial era. Mostly. There were some other folks that they did not get along with, but generally speaking, they were doing just fine. They were noted when colonists arrived for their extensive cultivation of a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. They would build large wooden structures, dedicated storage buildings for their agricultural output, and a very organized, structured society, very advanced people. They spoke dialect of Algonquin, and that means that they were culturally and linguistically distinct, basically from anybody else in the Carolinas. Algonquin language family Indians mostly were in central Canada and then the coast of the northeastern, what's now the United States. And then they extended down the coast. And then like the southernmost Algonquin people were the Yawpim Indians.
That's pretty far.
Yeah, it is. But, I mentioned that other Algonquin language groups tended to have names for themselves that also meant people of the first light, and their names for themselves also would sound really similar because this is all the same language family. It's basically like the Romance languages, where a lot of words sound very similar across Spanish and Italian.
Yeah. Or Spanish and Portuguese, where it gets really close. So I have a question, and this may sound stupid or uninformed. Do we know why they went with people with the first light? Is it because the, sun rises in the east and they were all right on the coast?
That's my assumption. I did not find an explanation for why, but that is my assumption. Because if you look at a map of where the Algonquin language family tribes lived, they almost all lived on the east part of wherever they were.
Yeah. Okay. Just looking for a simple explanation. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Other groups with similar sounding names that are also Algonquin language groups include people like the Wampanoag of Massachusetts. So like you can hear that Wampanoag and Wiyapimiak, they sound very similar. And, there's a lot obviously of like cultural heritage that's shared there in addition to language.
Sure. I mean, people on the East Coast of North Carolina sound different than people in the mountains of North Carolina.
Very much so. Yes. Yes, very much so. When I was in college, one of my best friends in college grew up near Wilmington. When I went to like go visit their family with some other friends that went down there to spend the weekend with her family sounded so different, to the point that I remember her grandmother not really understanding things I said because I had such a thick mountain accent.
Oh, I got a story about that.
Okay.
I went to a wedding for like a second cousin. One of the groom's friends was there, and he was chatting with my dad, and he had a very thick accent, and his name was Tim, and the way he pronounced it might as well have been TEE-YUM.
Tim.
Yeah, Tim. And my father, he's got a very easy to say name, Chuck. He's like, I'm Chuck. He's like, and I'm Tim. And he's like, nice to meet you, Tim. And he's like, no, Tim. He's like, right, I'm Chuck. And you're Tim. He's like, no, Tim. And they had a good laugh about it because my father's response was genuine.
Yeah.
He just said what he heard. The guy was like, oh, ding dong.
So one feature of a lot of Southern accents, but especially the Appalachian accent, is that you insert diphthongs where they don't exist in regular English, and you remove them where they do in regular English. And so I had to practice saying the word rice because growing up it was rice, because there wasn't that diphthong there of like adding in the second vowel. But words like Tim would be Tiem, and that kind of thing was very common in the mountains anyway.
We've all got our things.
Yeah, totally.
I get real fun sometimes with stupid pronunciations. You've heard them.
Yes.
I've probably said stuff on this show. It's just like, what is that? What is he trying to say?
So, and I should know on that tip, I'm probably mispronouncing a lot of these native names. I spent some time like looking up specifically how do you pronounce the full name of the Yawpum Indians. And I think I have said it correctly, but I am very uncertain of that. And so if somebody out there knows the correct pronunciation, I welcome corrections at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. So, and that applies to all the names I'm about to say also.
Oh, we're still going with that.
Oh, yeah.
This is a good segue.
The Yawpum Indians were one component of a larger Algonquin-speaking nation occupying Assamaquamuk, which I also have probably just mispronounced, which was the Algonquin name for the coastal region of what we now call North Carolina. That nation was led by the Chowanok Indians, who had a capital city on a bluff overlooking the river near the modern-day town of Harrellsville, North Carolina. And I think it's worth mentioning because their capital city, it was fortified, it was carefully planned, it included multiple public squares and public buildings, it had a temple district, it had a district for the king and other nobles of their nation. It was a mile long. It had planned and delineated fields designed to maximize their agricultural output, and it was home to several thousand people. This was a huge city and a very old culture. This was their capital from 825 AD to the 1600s.
Wow.
And we never hear about that in history class.
That's wild. That's a really long time.
Yes, nearly 1,000 years of continuous occupation by the same culture.
Whoa, buddy. The United States of America have existed for a little over 200. Do you mean to tell me that 1,000 is more than that? You're using like, new math from the 80s.
Right. Like, I had no idea about this until literally this episode.
Yeah, that's what's crazy to me is the length of time. I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah. Archaeological digs there have radiocarbon dated the first evidence of human habitation and organized human habitation to 825 AD.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's just totally wild to me. So
history and science together. Yeah. Two flavors that go great together. History and science.
I mentioned that also probably because I want to circle back at some point to talk about them in another episode, because the Chowanok are also historically significant in the Carolinas. Archaeological evidence now points to them having taken in the lost colony and given them land, specifically a reservation of their own to farm for themselves after they had to abandon the first colony site.
So on that topic of the lost colony, people have asked us to do that a lot. We are going to do it. It's in Michael's column on topics because he's excited about it. Please stop suggesting that one. We're going to do it.
We are going to talk about it. I used to live down the street from somebody who worked with the archaeological digs trying to find evidence of where they went. Yep. And there's a lot of information out there. There's actually a lot of really new information in just the last couple of years. So
we're saving that one up. Well, there's a couple that we've been sitting on, some of the bigger, more well-known ones like that, because, if you do them all at once, then what are you left with?
Right. The Yawpum Indians were also one of the first native peoples encountered when Captain Philip Amadas, I'm going to say Amadas, was scouting the Albemarle Sound region for a good location to start the Roanoke colony in 1585.
This looks nice. Yeah. Amadas.
Yeah, whatever his name is. When I read his name, I think of Captain Adama from Battlestar Galactica.
We'll be taking this now. This is mine. Amadas.
Yeah. In 1660, Kiskatanu, who was recorded as the king of the Yawpum, granted land to Nathaniel Batts in Virginia, and in 1662 granted more land to George Durant in what's now North Carolina. And those were actually the first land deeds recorded in the colonial era.
There you go.
Yeah, in this region anyway. The Yalpam had about 1,000 people in 1600, but by 1700, at roughly the time of our story, the Yalpam were estimated to have only 200 people left, following their total decimation by exposure to European diseases and a series of conflicts with English colonists.
I say, would you like my illnesses?
Pretty much. And in 1704, they were granted a 16 square mile reservation by the colonial government, but they were effectively extinct within 50 years as they sold their reservation lands to English colonists. And importantly, as English men who outnumbered women 8-1 in the colony began marrying Native American women, and English culture began to overwrite those indigenous ways of life.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that happens.
Yeah, that's, I'm not saying that it was a good thing, but it is what happened.
Yeah.
That brings us up to 1700 in Currituck County, North Carolina. What is now Currituck County, North Carolina?
Let's get witchy.
Yes. Again, thank you to the person who walked up to our table and told me about this, because I had never heard of this person, and this is fascinating to me. The legal structures and institutions in the colonial government at the time of this story were not entirely dissimilar from our own.
Okay.
But there isn't a ton of everyday language discussion of them, and the structures that were used legally, such as like which courts existed or were responsible for trying what sorts of crimes, would shift from time to time. But here is a very basic and probably factually inaccurate summary so that we can talk about it in a little informed way. The Carolina colony at the time of the story was one colony encompassing both of what we now call North Carolina and South Carolina. And the colony was technically owned by the English crown, but the crown had granted authority of direct government to a council of 8 men called the Lords Proprietors in the 1660s.
Ooh, that's a cool name for a club.
Isn't it?
We are the Lords Proprietors. Behold. I just said behold. I don't know. I don't know what you're beholding, but you're going to be holding all that land.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty much what their job was, literally. They were just people who were assigned to sit on the deeds. These positions and the rights granted to them were hereditary.
Great.
Yeah, right. It's obviously the way to run a business.
My dad owns a dealership.
Yeah, exactly. My uncle works for Nintendo. Each of these 8 men, who were the first Lords Proprietors, either had remained loyal to the crown during the English Civil War in the middle of the 1600s, or they were people who had very quickly rushed to re-support the crown as soon as Cromwell lost that war.
It was a joke. We're cool.
As soon as the parliamentarians lost that war, that's who it was. So anyway, those people all had names that we readily recognize today. Names like Carteret and Stanley, which are the names of counties in North Carolina. Colleton, which these days is the town of Collington in Dare County. All of these are used now for place names in one way or another. And these Lords Proprietors were tasked with establishing an explicitly feudal system of government. And in fact, the Carolina colony had specific ranks of nobility created by the crown to be assigned by the Lords Proprietors only to people here.
Okay. This sounds awful.
There were 2 noble ranks. One of them was a landgrave, which is roughly equivalent to a baron, and a cacique, which is just sort of one step above a knight.
Cacique don't like it. Rock the colony. Rock the colony.
So the Lords Proprietors were also tasked with setting up the legal system, including the courts, and they created a high court which tried certain types of cases considered important enough for their attention. The high court would also review the findings of lower courts when they involved certain severe punishments, such as execution.
Okay, so kind of like our Supreme Court.
Exactly. These lower courts were at the level of the, quote, precinct, roughly equivalent to county courts today. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the language that they used was county, and sometimes it was country, and sometimes it was precinct. So it gets very confusing. These precinct courts were made up of local officials, and juries were drawn from these local populations of landowning white men. It was part of the deal. These precinct courts would send summaries of their findings to the higher court once in a while also, even if these cases that they were looking at were not ones that the high court needed to decide anything about. It was basically attempted record keeping.
Did the lower courts wear the funky wigs?
I don't know. There aren't a lot of photographs left.
I imagine the high courts would wear the funky wigs.
I don't know when the wigs came into the English legal system, but I bet they did.
But then I imagine the local courts being like, all right, well, we got to draw a jury from a very specifically narrow slice of our population that is already very small.
Yeah.
And being like, oh, dad got the wig out of the box. He must be going to court. Jury duty again. Well, there's only about 7 of us right now that are eligible. So, jury duty again.
Funny you say that. The same names pop up in the jury lists over and over and over and over again during this time.
If you have to own land and be a man, specifically a white man, I mean, that sort of narrows your pool as people are coming over on ships just trying to live. You're not like rolling up like, and now I own this, because as we've talked about in other episodes, when land was granted, they would just take these massive swaths and be like, and you get 500 acres and you get 1,000 acres because we like you and nepotism is very real. And you get 200 acres because we don't like you. And but you know what I mean? Like even the people that were just like, we're giving you a paltry bit, we're still these massive swaths of land. Yeah.
Huge, enormous.
So all 7 eligible jurors.
Exactly. So
on their fancy hats.
In their fancy hats. The fact that there are like multiple names for the same unit of administration might make it seem like the colonial government under the Lords Proprietors was a total dumpster fire. And that's because it was a total dumpster fire. I think it's worth mentioning that. Things were really badly organized. The Lords Proprietors themselves mostly had no direct knowledge of anything happening in the colonies. They had never been here.
Because they inherited the role. You said it was a hereditary thing. It was just like, well, my dad owns a dealership, so I get to mind the used car side of the lot. And I don't really know what's going on, but this is me, and I signed the papers.
Yeah. Even among the first 8 Lords Proprietors, 6 of them had never been to the New World and never went.
That's good.
Yeah. And that's what happens when you have a hereditary government and it plays favorites. I mean, that's just like playing make-believe. Like that would be like if I bought, you know how you can buy like a little piece of, is it Scotland or Ireland where you can buy a piece of it? Yeah, one of the two. You can buy a little piece of it. That would be like if I bought enough pieces to actually make a piece of land and then just never win. Yeah. I think in a previous episode recently, I described land grants in the colonies as basically being the NFTs of their era. Mm-hmm. Like maybe this exists, maybe this place is real, maybe it's not, but here it is. And somebody told you that it's valuable and now you're going to turn around and resell it. That was the whole deal. Yeah. I actually have a story for the fall about a site that's super interesting. It's going to make a really good story. And part of the story is that it was purchased by someone in another country. It's here in the US, but it was purchased by someone in another country. And that actually led to some of the problems that occurred at the site because they were just never there. They bought it as an investment thing. They were like, I'm going to buy this and sit on it until I can sell it. Yeah. Speculation. Anyway, sorry. Exactly. No. Well, I mean, land speculation is still a problem. These were really super badly organized. Most of the people in charge had no direct knowledge of this place, much less how to run something this big in a way that might be a successful business venture. And the colonies were absolutely a business venture for the crown. And so in the early 1700s, the crown split the Carolina colony into North and South in hopes of retooling the administration of them. And when that didn't work, the crown actually bought out all but one of the Lords Proprietors and took over direct administration, which, well, we know how that worked out, as North Carolina was the first colony to instruct its delegates to vote for independence in 1776. But my freedoms! But, they were trying to shuffle the deck on management. And one of the effects of this poorly run, maybe it's a government, maybe it's a branch office for the corporate headquarters kind of organization, was that records from this era are extremely spotty. Sure. It's also an effect of time, and we've talked about that many times, the way records get damaged or destroyed. And in a bunch of places in the actual literal record for this story, there are, in place of a word or phrase, it'll simply say torn to indicate that the page was physically damaged before it was ever transcribed. Singed, watermark, torn, my favorite book. Exactly. So I say all of that as a preface to this, which comes directly from the records of the court of the Currituck precinct dated August 31st, 1703, in an update that it sent to the High Court. Currituck Precinct, August the 31st, 1703. The deposition of Thomas Boucher, aged 39 years or thereabout, saith that upon the 24th of July, 1703, your deponent's household or family was then in perfect health, excepting one person, which was recovering. The same day at eve, I, your deponent, called one Thomas Walker, a servant of your deponent's, to come to meet. But he instantly cried out that his pains was so great that he could not come, crying out of his belly and stomach, and so continueth disabled to this day. The next morning, it being the 25th of July, 1703, the aforesaid Walker's wife came from John Evans' house, and your deponent said to her, I was very glad that she was come, that she might nurse her husband.
She's like, gross. I don't want to deal with that. What do you want me to
Within
do?
1 hour or two, my wife was taken with a pain in her feet so extremely and severely that she cried out and acquainted me that the pain was in such, it's like really clumsy English, and acquainted me that the pain was in such sort that her feet felt as if 1,000 nails was piercing them,
That's
and
gout.
could have no ease but when her feet was put in hot water. So she continued 24 hours. Then the pain ceased in her feet, but she was tormented in her bowels to the day of her death, the which sickness continued about a month, and many helpful men and women endeavored to give her ease and help, but all in vain, and it was observed that she was taken sick. She cried out of John Evans, his wife, still saying that she was an evil woman, and that she was satisfied that she suffered those great pains by her means, and earnestly desired me to have her examined and searched, for she should certainly die, but it may serve to prevent her from doing more mischief. This she said with many more words, which I really love that note, relating to the said Evans, his wife, adding that she could not slumber, but she thought of her before many persons present, so that in about a week after she was taken, I, Thomas Boucher, your deponent, was also taken with strange and unusual pains in my stomach and belly and privy parts, and am
His butt. He had bubble guts.
and am still afflicted to this day, so that I and my wife could hardly tell which should die first. And Thomas Taylor and his wife and all the people of my family were so bad that one could not help another. Sometime before my wife died, John Evans came for me to meet his wife at Mr. Thomas Vandermeulen's to appear before Mr. Richard Comonfort, for she that was his wife was not willing to hear such reports against herself. I readily went, and there acquainted what obligation my wife had laid on me to search the matter more plain. John Evans and his wife did abuse me and my wife, and he threatened me that he would much bruise my body. I acquainted him that I was sick. He said that he did not believe, but that I was as well as he. This is what is most pertinent, and what I can remember, the which I do attest and set my hand unto. The next part of the report from the precinct court to the high court is, to the Honorable General Court, Jonathan Evans, I humbly showeth, whereas your petitioner, having his wife brought to this honorable court as a conflicted person, being concerned with familiar spirits under the notion of a witch, to your petitioner's great damage and detriment, your petitioner humbly prays that this honorable court may bring the same to proof and trial, living so far a distance, and your petitioner, as in duty bound, shall pray. And then after that, there is, to the Honorable the General Court, the humble petition of Susannah Evans most humbly showeth that Thomas Boucher hath put your petitioner to great charge and trouble by causing your petitioner to be committed for a witch, and your petitioner humbly prays your honors will be pleased to grant an attachment against the said Boucher's estate. So the short, plain language version of all that is that on the 24th and 25th of July, Deborah Boucher and one of her servants, this guy named Mr. Walker, fell severely ill with abdominal pains and pains in their legs and feet. Deborah Boucher accused Susannah Evans of having used witchcraft to make her sick. So Thomas Boucher asked Susannah Evans and her husband, John, to meet so that they could settle things. They got together at the house of some third party and a third Thomas, because like everybody in this story is named Thomas. But instead of hashing things out, Susannah Evans and her husband, John, both showed up just like raring to go, ready to fight Boucher. By this point, Boucher had also fallen ill, and he and his wife Deborah believed they both were probably going to die from this. Deborah did die in late August, so Thomas filed a charge against Susannah Evans in the local courts, accusing her of witchcraft. John Evans and Susannah Evans filed countersuits saying, this is garbage and a pain in the neck because we don't live anywhere near the courthouse. So if this goes to trial, I want some of their money. And that's the case that was brought.
So the feet thing sounds like the gout. Like needle, like nails in the feet. That sounds like gout.
Yeah, the term we would use for it today is peripheral neuropathy.
And the stomach stuff, I immediately go to like, where was the water supply coming from? Was it cholera? Did everybody just have cholera?
Yeah, like I get there. I'm going to get there. We're going to talk about what it might have been.
But I like that the default isn't food poisoning or cholera or anything like that. It's like, yeah, the witch has afflicted us. Like, how much do you hate this person? Knowing that they can get killed for it.
Yeah. It says a lot that Deborah Boucher hated Susannah Evans so much that as she lay dying, she was like, you know what? To heck with her.
Screw that lady. I hate her so much. No, I'm still alive. That was just gas.
Reading this, I thought, well, was witchcraft as bad in the Carolina colony as it was in, say, Salem, Massachusetts? So another little brief legal aside. At the time, there were very few laws specific to the Carolina colony. The Lords Proprietors and the legal system and everything had all been created as part of this document called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina in 1669, when governance of the colony was granted to them. And it was in a court that was created under that document that this case was brought. So mostly English law applied to the colonies, anything that happened in them. And in fact, the expectation was the courts in the colonies would rely on their current understanding of English law as practiced and prosecuted in England, unless laws were made in the colony to apply to that colony. A lot like federal law and state law in the United States today. Mm-hmm. In English law at the time, witchcraft was illegal under English common law, but there were minor acts of witchcraft and major acts of witchcraft, which had been defined in statutes. And the death penalty was only applied to major incidents, such as when someone was accused of having killed someone with witchcraft, or for second offenses.
Or for second.
It is explicit. You could basically only get killed under English common law for witchcraft if you killed someone else with witchcraft and were found guilty of it, or if it was your second time up and you were found guilty of a second minor witchcraft incident. Importantly, colonial courts and governments did not solely rely on the formal statutes established by the Crown or by Parliament, nor on their own formal statutes. Like I said, they also relied on English common law, which was not written down, was not formalized, and mostly was just sort of the body of legal precedents that had been set by earlier courts in other jurisdictions. Because it was established by precedent, there were these handbooks that got written and printed by various quote-unquote legal experts of their time, and those handbooks would get used as references by justices of the peace, courts, juries, anybody else who had to be involved in the making of legal decisions. And one of those was a book titled The Country Justice. It was published in the early 1600s, and that's where it lists it as a felony to use witchcraft to kill, injure, or maim other people. And this book was really popular in the colonies in the 17th and 18th
It's
centuries.
like they have to define it as a method. Like, are there okay ways to kill, injure, or maim people? It's like when you're writing a policy for something and you get like way overly specific and then you wind up creating a loophole on accident.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me just how convoluted this was. Also, witchcraft had been explicitly removed from church courts and assigned to secular courts under the jurisdiction of the crown, so that people who were accused of witchcraft could gain the theoretical benefits of things like jury trials and requirements of proof.
Yeah, I think that's probably good. I mean, it sucks that it's still a thing, but that's probably a good move.
Yeah. And the reason why instances like the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts resulted in a lot of executions on zero evidence is because A, that was a different colony with different laws, which B, were written by religious extremists. We need to remember that law in the Massachusetts colony and Puritan communities was basically the Sharia law of its time.
Right. I mean, that's why we describe things that are pretty archaic as puritanical.
Yeah. And C, the Massachusetts colony was, at that moment, in the middle of a lapse between the crown ordering their colonial laws expunged for being too freaky and providing new laws to replace them.
Oh, good heavens, they're doing what?
Yeah, things were so bad that the crown ordered that the colonial laws in the Massachusetts Bay Colony be abandoned and said, we'll send you new ones. And they hadn't sent the new ones yet. What that did was leave legal institutions in Massachusetts basically free to do whatever they felt like for any reason or for no reason. And that's one of the reasons why that particular instance of a witchcraft trial craze encouraged really opportunistic accusations. Literally, there was no law.
Sure.
So English colonizers did believe in witchcraft and they did have common laws against it. But in the Carolina colony, it was quote unquote only going to be a year in prison for the small stuff. And otherwise somebody had to die. and somebody had to be found guilty of killing them with witchcraft, or they had to be found guilty of the minor stuff more than once in order for execution to really be on the menu, because the Carolina colony had never set more specific statutes. And in this case, Susannah Evans was being accused not just of witchcraft, but of having killed Deborah Boucher using it. So execution was a possibility. Courts at the time worked much the same way they do now, where serious charges had to be heard by a grand jury before they were ever brought to trial. Again, I am not a lawyer and I'm not a legal expert, but grand juries had been a thing in the English legal system since the 12th century. And the 12-person jury and the 16 to 23-person grand jury has been a part of our legal system ever since. Basically, everywhere English is spoken. So grand juries, or what was called Le Grand Inquest, were originally instituted in order to extend the power of the crown into communities where a royal agent, like a justice of the peace or somebody else that got sent from England, might not know enough about the goings on to have a sense of when a crime had been committed or whether it was worth pursuing charges or anything like that. Grand juries were drawn from members of the local community, and so they were considered to be more in touch with local affairs and more likely to be on the side of local people. They were also intended to be another curb on the authority of church-run courts by creating this semi-secular alternative that was local, that could respond to stuff really quickly. Mm-hmm. A grand jury, like I said, it doesn't decide guilt. They decide whether an accusation warrants a trial in the first place. So if you're watching the news and they talk about some, accused mobster being indicted by a grand jury, that means that a panel of regular people heard evidence and testimony and decided, yeah, it's worth pursuing. It isn't did they do it? It's, is it worth a trial to see if they did it? Mm-hmm. So in the colonies, especially, grand juries were an important buffer between colonial subjects and the sort of overreach by authorities of the crown that ultimately led to things like the American Revolution.
Freedom!
Exactly. As such, grand juries in the American colonies especially were often referred to as people's panels or the people's panel because they could prevent criminal accusations by the English government from being used against colonists for political purposes.
This week on the People's Panel. Bum, bum.
I don't like legal dramas. I would totally watch a Law and Order colonial era.
A lot of executions.
I would imagine a lot of executions. So this role of protecting average citizens from the government is why the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution explicitly mentions that no citizen can be charged with certain more serious crimes unless indicted by a grand jury. That wasn't an innovation, that was a preservation of what was in English law already. Under the English legal system at the time of the colonies, if a grand jury decided an accusation should be tried in court, they would return a finding called true bill. If they found an accusation did not warrant a trial, they returned a finding of, quote, ignoramus, which is literally Latin for we are ignorant, or we do not know about that. If you think of an example of I heard Nobby the Sasquatch and the vampire beast of Bladenborough belonged to the same carpool, and your answer to that was, I don't know about that, then that's basically what you're saying.
Gotcha. Okay.
And that's actually where the term ignoramus as an insult in English comes from. In 1615, a play titled Ignoramus was produced in England, and it was about a dim-witted lawyer named Ignoramus who thinks he's a lot smarter than he really is. And that play introduced the use of the legal term into English as a personal insult.
Well, I'm glad that Dunning-Kruger has been a thing for a real long time.
Yeah. So if you call somebody an ignoramus now, you're literally comparing them to the title character of a 17th century play. Kind of like in Community, when they start using Britta's name as an insult and say things like, "Why you really Britted that?" It's exactly like that.
I just like that it's about a lawyer that thinks they're smarter than they are.
Yeah, very much so. It was apparently written by academics who hated lawyers, and it made lawyers really mad at academics. And there was a bunch of stuff written about this. It was very interesting to read about.
The intellectual equivalent of two groups just going and slapping at each other feebly.
Very much so. So, what did the grand jury do in Currituck in 1703 when witchcraft was illegal and an accusation of murder by witchcraft was so serious that it had to go before the grand jury to find out whether it was worth going to trial? On Wednesday, October 27th, so 2 months later, 1703, this is in the report sent by the Currituck court to the High Court. Presentment is made to the grand jury that Susannah Evans of the precinct of Currituck in the county of Albemarle in the province of North Carolina, not having the fear of God before her eyes, but being led by the instigation of the devil, 2 L's, did on or about the 25th day of July last pass the body of Deborah Boucher, being then in the peace of our sovereign lady the queen, devilishly and maliciously bewitch, and by assistance of the devil afflict with mortal pains the body of said Deborah Boucher, whereby the said Deborah departed this life, and also did diabolically and maliciously bewitch several other of her majesty's liege subjects against the peace of our said sovereign lady the queen, and against the form of the statute in that case made and provided, and the marshal is commanded to come, etc. And there came a long list of names of the jury, which I'll come back to, but for now, just note that the foreman of the grand jury was this guy named Cornelius Jones, who were impaneled, and is sworn saying, "We, the jury, find no bill, and the person ignoramus, and it is ordered that the said Susannah Evans be acquitted, paying the charges."
Yeah, because that is the stupidest. That is so petty. Like, it's so obvious that it was just like we don't like her.
Yeah.
Like, what?
And the next entry in that report from the same day in the same grand jury proceedings, presentment is made to the grand jury that Martha Richardson of the precinct of Currituck in the county of Albemarle, etc., having the fear of God before her eyes, but being, etc., on by the instigation of the devil, did blah 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 on the 20th day of July last passed the body of William Parker, being in the peace of our sovereign lady of the queen, devilishly and maliciously bewitch, and by assistance of the devil afflict the body of her liege subjects against the peace of blah blah blah, etc. And so this other woman named Martha Richardson is also accused of having injured people with witchcraft. The same long list of names, because it's the same grand jury, still with Cornelius Jones as foreman, who were impaneled and sworn, saying, "We of the jury find no bill, and the person ignoramus, and it is ordered that said Martha Richardson be acquitted, paying the charge." And so on the same day, they returned an ignoramus ruling on 2 witchcraft accusations.
Well, yeah, because they were crap.
Yeah. And then it says, upon petition of John Evans, showing that the estate of Thomas Boucher, deceased, because he had died of whatever they had by this point, is indebted to him and diverse persons in this government, and that the said estate is in danger by a person unknown to be conveyed away out of this government. So like somebody's going to grab his stuff and run. Ordered that the provost marshal take into his custody the said Boucher's estate and the same to secure until disposed of in the due course of law. He was like, that guy's dead. My wife is innocent. I want his stuff.
Sure.
I find it so fascinating that they found insufficient evidence or concern to send Susannah Evans even to trial for witchcraft, and they just dropped the charges. And that they also took the opportunity to return a finding of ignoramus on a totally unrelated witchcraft charge lodged at the same time by somebody else against this Martha Richardson. I couldn't find anything else about Martha Richardson. Like, it's in the historical record, but I could find nobody else talking about it. Again, records are extremely sketchy from this time.
What a silly thing. This is like the first wrongful arrest lawsuit.
Yeah, it is. In a lot of ways, it really is. I love the idea that John Evans countersued on the same day. And it's like his heirs are going to take his stuff, and I want my slice before they run out of town. I read somewhere that the Evans' suit against the Boucher's estate was not granted, which honestly I think is too bad, because I feel like they deserved something for their trouble.
When you're accusing someone of something that rises to the level of punishment of execution,
yeah,
like, no, all bets are off. I'm coming for your stuff.
Yeah.
This isn't like, oh, I got a parking ticket and I want to contest it. Like, no, you tried to kill me.
Yeah. So, like, why does it all matter? Like, why did I go on at length about the jury and everything? Because that Cornelius Jones was Captain Cornelius Jones. A 1957 book by Jesse F. Pugh called 300 Years Along the Pasquotank, which is a river in the region, has a brief biographical sketch of Cornelius Jones. He was born in 1660. He died in 1714. He was a prominent merchant captain with routes to Europe and back, and routes to New England and back.
Eli Blood!
I saw a bunch of citations which point out that Jones was very likely in and around Massachusetts at the time of the Salem witch trials, and either saw firsthand or heard from firsthand witnesses what it was like to live through a witch scare. When we say Salem witch trials, the place we're talking about is now called Danvers, Massachusetts. But at the time of the trials, it was Salem Village, which was kind of a suburb of Salem Town. Salem Village was this rural farming area a few miles inland, but Salem Town was a bustling port city, including among its many industries, shipbuilding. So yeah, a working merchant captain who went to New England and back knew about Salem Town and probably went there a lot to have things like supplies and repairs made.
So yeah, I mean, for me, I'm connecting dots here where I'm like, all right, well, the Currituck story obviously is what it is, but it does seem to borrow elements from this verifiable story, we are getting a lot of mileage out of a story that I was really hard on the first time. And I'm glad I was hard on it because it helps us dissect stuff like this through a different lens.
Yeah. Pew, in his book, 300 Years Along the Pasquotank, points out that the historical records show us two things, well, more than two things, about Captain Cornelius Jones. He was called on to serve on juries and grand juries a lot. You remember at the front, we were talking about, like, there were very few people who could be on these things, meaning he had influence. And he was trusted in the legal system to get good outcomes. I leave it up to other people to define exactly what good outcomes means, whether that means like it's good for the Lord's proprietors or good for the crown or good for the people around them or good for the truth or whatever combination of those. But the other big thing about him, when he was the foreman of a jury, they almost always indicted people and sent them to trial. He was not a habitually merciful jury foreman for the grand juries. He was habitually strict. Pew gave us an example of a case in which a man brought charges of defamation of character against a woman who called him a hog-stealing rogue. That's all she said. And a jury headed by Captain Jones found her guilty and fined her the equivalent of $350.
Can't be accusing people of piggy stealing.
Jones was not a dude who took stuff lightly.
Taking that bacon.
Taking bacon.
You, sir, accused of taking bacon by this woman. I didn't take any bacon.
Love the smoky flavor of crime. So,
thick cut crime. But thick is spelled like THICC. Thick cut crime.
Yeah.
Taking bacon.
Yes.
A Cornelius adventure. All right, I'll shut up.
So that jury, headed by Jones, who had almost certainly seen Salem Town, Massachusetts firsthand in his career, returned a refusal to indict on two cases on the same day, and in one of them, somebody had died. Pew's take on it is that Jones went out of his way to quash accusations of witchcraft in the precinct court in order to head off a round of witch trials and accusations in the Carolina colony. And I agree. I think Susannah Evans and Martha Richardson were spared trials so that local leaders could send the message that whatever happened in Salem Village, where hundreds of people were accused and 25 people died, 20 of them directly by execution in one form or another, would not be allowed to happen here.
Yeah. He's like the opposite of how Eli Blood is written as the witch finder mariner from Massachusetts. But in my head, this is the story that inspired that character.
Totally. There were apparently later rounds of accusations, and there were times when people in North Carolina were put on trial. But in this case, the charges against Susannah Evans and Martha Richardson got tossed out, and Susannah Evans even turned around and countersued. And I love that. I just love that for her.
So doing the research and looking at witch trials in North Carolina, it's kind of awesome that this one person was consistently involved in juries and stuff and was just like, we're not doing that here.
Yeah.
Like, take your petty squabbles somewhere else.
Yeah.
I have goods to transport on my boat. Good day.
I thought, like, next I would look into, like, why did they die?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth noting that another topic this touches on, and about which I am distinctly not an expert or even a terribly bright amateur, is medicine. Like, I couldn't resist looking into it. So the record shows that both Thomas and Deborah complained of severe abdominal pains and peripheral neuropathy. Neuropathy is associated with any number of medical conditions of all kinds of sources today, like diabetes, HIV. There are like so many different things that cause it. So it's kind of hard to narrow things down. But whatever killed them had to either be a contagious disease or it had to be an environmental factor that they were both exposed to. And like, I went and made WebMD really concerned about my well-being by searching for terms like peripheral neuropathy, abdominal pain, and death. But the better question is not what might have caused these symptoms. And is instead of that, the better question is like, what doesn't?
Right.
Like, I write books. I'm an educated amateur, and that means I'm good at looking up more or less believable ways to kill people, but I'm not exactly informed. That said, it's really common for well water to be contaminated with arsenic.
Okay.
Arsenic is found naturally in soil and in rocks. It leaches right out of the ground. And in fact, the EPA set a stricter standard for what's considered acceptable or unacceptable for it in 2001 because it's so common in well water in America today. It could be poisons. It could be any number of infectious diseases. It could be all kinds of things. It could have been Lyme disease. There's like so many different things that would have caused it. It could also be intentional poisoning. If I were going to use this in a story, I would probably make it be arsenic in their well water, only because it was so common. But who knows? Obviously, all of this has a familiar ring to it. Like we said, it's got big Cora Tree vibes. And in fact, Hatteras, where the Cora Tree story is said to have happened, is a hop and a skip across a couple of sounds. And I think there's a very high chance that old Charles Wedby knew about the story and used it to form the core of the narrative. And my pet theory is that he took those elements of the accused witch and the sea captain who's seen witch trials go down up north, being the person who decides her fate and all that, and jazzed it up by giving her supernatural powers and having him find her guilty, but letting her get away. But the narrative similarities are not the only reason I think that, because the big list of names comprising the jury includes one John Widby.
What? Get out! Oh, I'm glad you saved that for the end. I guess we're at the end. Wow.
Yeah. To be clear, I don't know that Charles Wedby was a direct descendant of John Widby, but I will say that I could follow Charles Wedby's family back through census records as far as his great-grandfather Thomas Clayton Wedby, born in this area where the story happens in the late 1700s, which is just a couple of generational hops from the time this story takes place.
Oh, we're connecting those dots. I'm in. They're related.
Totally. Looking at the North Carolina Genealogical and Historical Record, Volume 1, published in 1900, which is just a big list of like transcribed family Bibles and probated wills and anything else people could get their hands on at the time to try to organize the records. This area where this story happens is just chock full of Wedbys going back to the 17th century.
A barrel of Wedbys.
It really is. It long predates our story. And a lot of them were lawyers or officers of the court or judges, just like Charles Wedby, who was a retired judge before he became a folklorist.
Oh, chuckles. Oh, we're on to you now.
So I submit that it isn't just that Charles Wedby saw this case in the historical record and decided to base a piece of fiction on it and wrap it around an homage to his friend who had spent years working with the outdoor theater company producing The Lost Colony. I think Charles Wedby might have heard this story handed down to him in family lore because a direct ancestor sat on the grand jury and was in the room when Captain Jones told them what it was like in Massachusetts when people got a witch scare going, and he saw a way to add another little stitch in a long row of them, tying his family and their history to the history of the region by constructing the legend of the Cora Tree.
I'm making that up. I mean, sorry. No, this is awesome though. We know that the story's made up, the Cora Tree story.
Yeah.
That it's fabricated. And now we have two pieces of motivation as to why and how it was constructed. And deconstructing Wedby should just be a theme.
Yeah.
I got to revisit some of those old books of his.
Yeah. So, like I said at the end of the Daniel Keith episode, where sometimes folklore is both the shadow on the wall and the vine we plant to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this case, Wedby's story of the Cora Tree is both an entertaining piece of fiction and it's a nod to a very real moment when people looked at what might have been and decided to go a different path.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much for doing all the research on this. This was twists and turns.
Really enjoyed it. I really want to thank whoever walked up to the table and said that to me.
This is great.
And that's actually the end.
Okay. Housekeeping stuff. If you're still with us, we are going to be appearing at Con Carolinas in Charlotte in June. We are hoping to be in Winston-Salem in July for something. Hoping
Congregate.
Yeah. I didn't want to say it because I didn't know if we were confirmed or not.
I am officially a guest to Congregate, so I will be asking if we can do a live recording again.
At the very least, you can go see Michael at Congregate in Winston-Salem in July. And likewise, at the very least, at Dragon Con, part of the American Sci-Fi Classics track, you can visit Michael. He will be a visiting professional. Did I get that term right?
An attending professional.
An attending professional at Dragon Con in August in Georgia. And then in October, we will be in Abbeville, South Carolina. Details are still getting worked out on what exactly that will look like. At the very least on that one, you'll get me.
Yeah. And Dragon Con weekend is Labor Day weekend.
Yes. And the Abbeville one is October 7th to 9th at the historic Belmont Inn Haunted Hotel. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on.
Thanks for hanging in there. This was a long one, but I really enjoyed it.
Good day. I'm taking my wig off now, putting it back in the box till tomorrow when I am picked for jury duty again.
Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thanks for joining us. If you liked it, give us a rating, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, send us an email and tell us why. If you're not wrong, we'll try to fix it.
And if you're interested in award-winning speculative fiction, including science fiction, urban fantasy, and horror, find me, Michael G. Williams, at www.michaelgwilliamsbooks.com and check out Falstaff Books at falstaffbooks.com.
If you'd like to pick up some Arcane Carolinas merch, look at behind-the-scenes info, pictures, videos, stuff like that, all the things that get cut, check out arcanecarolinas.com, where you can get access to our Patreon, our Facebook, our Twitter, our Instagram, all that in one place, including the merch store. Buy a shirt.
Clothe your body.
Drape your body in our wares.
Be our living billboards.
Thanks for tuning in. Please give us a... I will say that again because there was a sound.